Okay, so today's video lesson is on an inspector calls, in particular tackling the question on the AQA paper. A quick reminder on the screen now as to where to head for more videos like this one. So this question comes up on paper 2, section A, 30-mark question plus 4 for SPAG. And as with other questions on the AQA paper, the 30 marks are broken down into 3 assessment objectives: AO1, AO2, AO3, 12, 12 and 6 mark allocation. Have a little read on the screen there for a breakdown, but we'll go through this in a lot more detail in a minute. So what does a question look like? Well, this is what it looks like, minus the blue squares and arrows. You get 2 questions, 2 essay questions, different to the Shakespeare and the Jekyll and Hyde questions, say on paper 1, where you've got an extract. These are 2 essay-based questions, and you must answer one. So you choose one or the other. The first one's usually on a character, the second question is usually on a theme. So here's an example of 2 questions. Arthur Burling is an appalling character with no redeeming features. So there's a character question. Second question is, how does J.B. Priestley present ideas about inequality in the play? Okay, so that's the 2 different question types. Another 2 selections. First one's about Sheila, and the second one is, how does Priestley explore responsibility in inspector calls? And that's the question I'm going to focus on in this video. So let's break the question down a little bit more. How does Priestley explore responsibility in inspector calls? Write about the ideas about responsibility in inspector calls and how Priestley presents these ideas by the ways he writes. So what do we mean here? So the question is asking about responsibility. So keep this theme at the centre of each point you make. You should reference this point in every paragraph to ensure that you're answering the question. That's AO1. The how part will be looking for you to explore the ways in which Priestley presents this theme, focusing on techniques and dramatic devices in your answer. And don't worry, I'll be looking at some of these in a minute as well. Okay, so how to approach this question. Unless you've got additional time, you've got about 45 minutes to answer this question. It's a 2-hour, 15-minute paper. You've got 3 sections. You've got an inspector calls, you've got the anthology poetry, and you've got the unseen poetry. So roughly 45 minutes for each section. You must do a plan. I'll say this again. The examiner's report every year states that students who show evidence of planning routinely secure higher marks. So 5 to 8 minute plan. So some questions to consider for planning this question. What is each character's attitude towards responsibility? How does Burling's attitude differ from Sheila's? Why does the inspector want each character to accept their responsibility? What is Priestley's attitude towards responsibility, and how do we know this? What is the inspector's warning in his final speech? Finally, what dramatic devices does Priestley employ? Go and have a little go. If you've got the access to the PDF download, then do print it off and make a few notes around each one of these questions. A good little revision task for you anyway, to test what you know, your knowledge on the play. I'll explore these in a lot more detail in a few minutes. Okay, so speaking of dramatic devices, as I promised, here are a few. Stage directions. Remember, it's a play. Think of what is particular about the format of a play. Well, stage directions is an opportunity for Priestley to instruct the director or the actors in how he wants them to behave and act, and how the stage should be set, and so on. Now, I've got another video which explores stage directions in a lot more detail than this, so please do check that out. Lighting is another technique, dramatic device that Priestley uses. Look at his opening stage directions. He says the atmosphere at the start, the lighting at the start should be pink and intimate, but then as soon as the inspector arrives, it should become brighter, harder. Look at the interpretations of each of these. Now, I've got another video which focuses on all the other dramatic devices, and I go into the lighting in a lot more depth in that, so do check that one out. Timings. Look at the precise moment the inspector arrives. It interrupts Burling whilst in full flow, telling the younger generation one should look after their own business. Now, that's not by accident. That's deliberately, because it foreshadows the clash between the inspector and Burling, and the clash between their political beliefs, between socialism and capitalism. The inspector himself is a literary device representing the views of Priestley's mouthpiece on stage. Dramatic irony. So the play was written and performed in 1945-46, but it was set in 1912. What's the significance of that? It allows us to see what sort of a poor judge of character or poor judge in general Burling is when he expresses his belief that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, for example. Symbolism even is another dramatic device that Priestley uses. So who and what does each character represent? For example, Eva Smith representing the poor, Burling representing capitalism, and so on. And then sound. The ring of the doorbell and the phone at the end, both sharply and both signalling the arrival of an inspector, reference to a time play. You can check in with another video about what a time play is as well. From the examiners as well, it's the training that we get encourages students to write a little brief introduction, setting out their kind of ideas behind the answer of their question. So sample introduction, opening point. So intro, the central theme in Inspector Calls is responsibility. Priestley is interested in both our personal responsibility for our own actions and our collective responsibility within wider society. There's an example of an opening an opening introduction you could have to this question. First point, Priestley uses the Burlings to explore his central theme of responsibility, in particular how age, gender and class affect people's attitudes towards it, and how prejudice can prevent people from acting responsibly. Some evidence to support that. Burling states that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself, and that's when the doorbell rings sharply, indicating the arrival of the inspector to challenge this view. Now remember, each paragraph should contain your Peter, and at least two should reference C. That's point, evidence, technique, explanation, reader or audience, impact. Audience in this case because it's a play, and then context. Not necessarily in that order, but so long as if you see it as a tick box, think, right, well, have I identified a technique or a dramatic device in this paragraph? Have I explained how that device is effective? So method and meaning is the kind of underpinning every answer. It should be. The method is the technique, the how part of the question, and the meaning answers the question. Okay, so there's a couple of pointers there. So let's beef up this first point so that it ticks all the top grade boxes the examiner is looking for. And you can see in black I've highlighted where the elements of P to C fall. So, first point could be something along the lines of Priestley uses the Burlings and Gerald to explore his central theme of responsibility. In particular, how age, gender and class affect people's attitudes towards it, and how prejudice can prevent people from acting responsibly. And there's my point. The primary proponent of this attitude is Arthur Burling, the portentous, self-made, successful capitalist who likes nothing more than to impart his pearls of wisdom on the younger generation present in his company. It is during one of these rants, where he's vehemently declaring that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself, and that he is so crudely interrupted by the doorbell ringing sharply off stage. Priestley's clever use of both stage directions and timing here foreshadows the ensuing battle between the socialist views of the inspector and the outdated, ill-judged capitalist views of Mr. Burling. The opening stage directions, which dictate that the lighting switches from pink and intimate to brighter and harder, could also be argued to reflect the journey of the audience being represented with the rose-tinted view of the successful, wealthy and celebrating Burlings of the opening scenes towards the realisation that the true Burlings are very different, the white light of truth being shone down on them, exposing how they operate, their attitudes towards the lower classes and their preoccupation with status and reputation. So I've identified the various elements the examiner is looking for in each paragraph to secure the top marks. So you can see that there. Now the beauty of English, and it is the beauty of English, is you could write and answer this question, and I could have 10 students in front of me, and they could all have received a grade 9 for it, and none of them look alike. They all look different. So long as you can reinforce your viewpoint with evidence and detailed explanation and justification, referencing context where necessary, where appropriate, you can get your top marks. So what other points could you make for this question? So here's the next point you could make. So I've broken it down for you: point, development and context. So the second point you could make is there's a generational divide in response to the inspector's interrogation. The older Burlings refused to accept any responsibility for their roles in the death of Eva Smith, whereas the reaction of Sheila and Eric contrasts with this greatly. Some evidence to support that. We all helped to kill her, Eric says. Mrs. Burling admits to being prejudiced against her case. So developing this point, the inspector is a dramatic device used by Priestley to dismantle the selfish capitalist views of the Burlings. Younger generation display the green shoots of change, offering hope for the future. The audience are supposed to like Sheila in particular, disliking her parents for their outdated and cruel attitude towards Eva and the workers in general. And context, the post-World War II society, reeling from 2 world wars, was ready to embrace change, and the younger Burlings represents this hope for the future. So again, if you've got access to the PDFs, do print them off, and you can. There's 2 more points on the next screen, and you see them. If not, pause, take some notes. In my experience, a 12-13 minute video takes my students like 40-45 minutes to work through and to make sure they understand everything that's contained on them. 2 further points. I'll read the point parts rather than all of it's on there. So the 3rd point you could make is this is reinforced towards the end of the play when they've established they've been had. In spite of still having acted in the way they were accused of, the older Burlings and Gerald now find it more of a joke than anything, more relieved at having avoided a public scandal. It frightens me the way you talk, Sheila says to her parents, witnessing this behaviour. She can't quite believe it. 4th point you could make, the inspector delivers a final warning, summing up Priestley's views on responsibility. This speech is as much for the benefit of the audience as it is for the Burlings and Gerald. Remember it, we are members of one body. If we don't learn our lessons of the past, we will suffer it in fire and blood and anguish. Millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. Remember that symbolism. What does Eva Smith represent, and what does John Smith represent? Okay, so there's lots of information there. One more thing. Finally, a reminder that if your membership package allows it, then you can submit a full answer to this question, or indeed any question, and I'll mark it and provide detailed feedback as to how you can improve to secure the top grade. Instructions as to how to do that will be found on the website. Okay, hope you found that useful. Do check in for further videos over at Mr. H Online, and we'll see you there. And best of luck in the exams whenever you're sitting them. Bye now.